Part 6. Technique. Everyone knows the difficulty of things that are exquisite and well done. So to have facility in such things give rise to the greatest wonder. Baldassare Castiglione, 1528. In the essay that follows, Darwin Ortiz makes this claim. The magic is not there to validate a dramatic premise. The dramatic premise is used to add impact to the magic, to make the experience of the impossible that much more powerful. Ortiz goes on to make the case that showmanship is a viable part of technique, but we must remember that it cannot take the place of technique or make up for a deficiency in skill. These words are also the only caution in this audiobook against over-presenting. The only thing worse than a magician who offers no presentation in his work is the magician who offers too much presentation and too little magic. Showmanship as Technique by Darwin Ortiz. Most writing on magic presentation falls into one of two categories. The first is the wear a clean shirt, smile a lot, and be yourself school. Certainly, this sort of advice isn't wrong. But it's so elementary and superficial that anybody who has gotten beyond the kindergarten stage of showmanship must sense that there has to be more to the subject. The other category is the sermonizing school. These are the magazine articles that exhort magicians to be more entertaining, think more about their audiences, etc. Like a preacher in the pulpit on Sunday morning, the author berates the reader for his sins and warns him to become more entertaining before he's smitten by the hand of God. The only thing the author doesn't do is tell the reader how to make his magic more entertaining. Cynic that I am, I always suspect it's because the author has no idea how. I figure that any magician who isn't entertaining either is totally oblivious to the impact he has on audiences, in which case he is beyond hope, or wants to improve but doesn't know how. In this book, Strong Magic, you won't find any sermons or diatribes, just a nuts and bolts approach that will tell you how. I expect that most magicians will label this book a work on magic theory. I don't see it that way. Our Magic is an example of a book on magic theory, and a brilliant one. This is a book on technique. I know that when magicians speak of technique, they mean sleight of hand moves. But there is another body of technique at least as important to your success as an entertainer. The theatrical and psychological techniques you employ to elicit the kind of reaction you want from an audience. In this sense, the book is analogous to a book on art technique, film technique, acting technique, or writing technique. If you want to paint, you had better understand the rules of perspective and composition. In film, a lap dissolve will have one effect on an audience, a match dissolve will have another. A fade will have a different effect. If you're going to direct a film and want to make sure the audience feels what you want them to feel, when you want them to feel it, you'd better know the difference. Then it's up to you to decide which one to use when. It's the same with magic. Technique comes, in part, from an understanding of underlying principles. For that reason, we will start our study of presentation with a brief discussion of theory. Just keep in mind that this is simply to establish a foundation for understanding what this book is really about, providing you with a set of concrete, practical tools you can use in different situations to affect the audience the way you want to affect them. Once you understand what these tools are, what they do, how they work, and how to apply them, it'll be your job as an artist to decide which ones to use for which jobs. As we proceed, you'll find there will be situations where you'll need considerable ingenuity and creativity to find ways to incorporate various techniques into a trick in order to achieve the effect you want to have on the audience. Good presentation, in fact, requires a great deal of creativity. In magic, creativity in fashioning presentations has never been as recognized and valued as creativity in devising effects and methods. I believe this is because most magicians are hobbyists who perform mainly for other magicians. Magician audiences are, of course, notorious for responding more strongly to effect and method than to presentation. However, if you perform for lay people, you'll find that presentation offers as fertile and challenging an outlet for creativity as effects and methods, and one that is at least as rewarding. Our task is amazement, not amusement. Always amazement first. René Lavon. Magic as mystery. A conjurer is nothing if he only amuses and fails to inspire wonder. Thomas Frost, The Lives of the Conjurers. Entertainment is broader than amusement. Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors is amusing. His Hamlet is not. Nevertheless, the fact that Hamlet is far more popular than the Comedy of Errors proves that it is also far more entertaining. Henning Nelms, Magic and Showmanship. Memorable magic. Witnessing a close-up magic performance can be an experience so memorable that the spectator will literally remember it for the rest of his life. If you think that's a ridiculous claim, consider this. Have you ever been at a social gathering where people learn that you're a magician, and immediately someone comes up to you and says, "You know, I saw a magician one time who did," then follows a vivid, although perhaps inaccurate description of some magic trick. "I'll never forget that." I think most of us have had this experience many times. Often the performance that person describes is something he witnessed 10 or 15 years ago, or even further back. Yet it made such a strong impression that the moment he heard the word magician, the experience popped into his head and he was impelled to tell you about it. Whenever I pick up a deck of cards to perform, my goal is to make such a strong impression on each spectator that whenever the subject of card tricks or card cheating comes up in the future, indeed, virtually any time he sees a deck of cards, he'll think of me. And I know that if I do my job right, that is exactly what will happen. I believe every close-up magician should set similar goals for himself. To do that, you have to focus on making your magic as strong as possible. Of the several fundamental premises that underlie this book, the most basic one is this. The magician's primary job is to entertain his audience with magic. Not merely to entertain his audience while doing magic, but to entertain them with magic. The most important source of entertainment should be the magic itself. Unfortunately, many magicians don't seem to believe that magic in itself can be entertaining to lay people. They feel that in order to hold their audience's attention, they have to lard their performances with bad jokes that would shame any borscht belt comic. They think the term commercial magic has to mean a string of lightweight 10-second gag or tricks relying on cuteness rather than mystery, but justifying their existence because they elicit a momentary chuckle or groan from the spectator. The result is a performance that is like watching old TV reruns of the Dukes of Hazzard. Mindless entertainment that momentarily diverts, but is forgotten almost the instant it's over. The magical experience. This sort of magic results from what I call Fitzky's fallacy, the belief that magic has no inherent entertainment value. In Showmanship for Magicians, Dario Fitzke's prescription for making magic entertaining is to introduce music, dance, comedy, and sex appeal into the magic performance. In his view, magic is some sort of bitter pill that you have to sugarcoat in order to get the audience to swallow. I don't want you to think I'm suggesting there is anything wrong with employing such elements to add to the appeal of a magic performance. But thinking that this is all there is to making magic, entertaining overlooks the most obvious and the most important way you can make magic more entertaining by making the magic itself more entertaining. If you don't believe that magic itself can be entertaining, if you don't believe that experiencing apparent impossibilities can be strong, unique, and memorable entertainment for an audience, I won't argue the point with you. I'll only suggest that you give up magic. If you really think that magic is of no value except as a peg on which to hang music, dance, comedy, and sex appeal, you should become a musician, dancer, comedian, or stripper, and forget about magic. I believe that not only can magic in itself be highly entertaining, but that magic offers an entertainment experience that is qualitatively different from what an audience can get from music, dance, comedy, or any other form of entertainment. Not necessarily better, but different. That unique entertainment experience comes from mystery, the experience of the impossible. Frankly, if you don't strongly want to give your audiences that particular entertainment experience, you don't belong in magic. Once you accept the premise that entertaining with magic is your main priority, you'll find it has some important implications. It doesn't mean that you turn your back on the possibilities of using comedy, storytelling, music, or other elements to enhance your magic. It does mean that your first priority is making your magic as powerful and memorable as possible. It means that you use elements like comedy primarily to make your magic stronger. If a gag strengthens the magic, it goes in. If a gag weakens the magic, it goes out. You must never lose sight of your primary goal, to make your audience experience mystery. If magic has any claim to being an art, it lies in its unique ability to make a spectator confront the impossible, along with the exhilarating feeling this entails as a trap door opens under everything he thinks he knows about reality, and his mind goes into free fall. Even viewed purely as entertainment, this feeling, the magical experience, is not only the most unique, but also the strongest entertainment experience you as a magician can give your audience. But before you can start working on affecting the audience's state of mind, you may have to change your own attitudes. The challenge attitude. There are many people in this world who hate bad magic. I'm one of them. But there are also people who hate good magic. Magic to them means that if you fool them, they lose and you win. If they catch you, they win and you lose. Fortunately, such people are few and far between. Of more concern is the fact that virtually any audience may fall into the mindset of viewing a magic performance as a win-lose situation. If you encourage them to, it's your job to make them see it as a win-win situation. If the magician wins, everyone wins. You get the satisfaction of entertaining them, and they get the pleasure of being entertained. If you lose, everyone loses. What could have been an enjoyable experience becomes a waste of time. A good magic performance is a cooperative venture, not a competitive one. The audience should actually be your allies in fooling them. A key to achieving this partnership with the audience is avoiding any sense of challenge in your presentation. The late Fred Robinson was fond of quoting Fred Capps to the effect that there is no place for challenge in professional magic. I would go further and say that there is no place for challenge in good magic. The performer who challenges his audience to figure out how the tricks are done is reinforcing the win-lose model. A problem arises when trying to get magicians to see the self-defeating nature of challenge magic. And it's one that I think I had best deal with head on. The problem is the fact that some of the most legendary figures in magic have used the challenge approach. In an interview in the English magic magazine Opus, Scottish cardman Gordon Bruce quite rightly advises novice magicians to avoid the challenge approach. He then goes on to say, Slidini does it all the time, but only gets away with it because he is a master. The fact is that Slidini only got away with it because he spent his entire life performing for other magicians. I don't believe Slidini could have ever sustained a career performing for laypeople without drastically altering his challenge style of presentation. The fact that he never succeeded in having such a career may indicate as much. Slidini's career consisted of performing for and lecturing to other magicians and, particularly, giving lessons to other magicians. As such, his presentational style should not provide a model for anyone interested in entertaining the public. Slidini was a genius whose thinking on misdirection revolutionized close-up magic, and who also contributed numerous seminal techniques to the table worker's armory. However, his challenge approach is so well known to magicians and represents such a perfect example of what not to do that I feel it necessary to analyze this negative feature of his work further. After fooling a spectator several times with the same effect, Slidini would ask him, "You know why you no see?" "Because you no watch." Translation: "You know why you didn't catch me? Because you're stupid." After fooling another spectator with several repetitions of the coins through the table, he would reassure him with the statement, "I do it again, and this time you catch." When Slidini did it again and the spectator still didn't catch, it was reasonable for him to wonder if there was something wrong with him. Presumably, other people usually caught on at this point. Even worse, the spectator would have to feel that he had failed in his mission. Slidini's comments made it clear that the spectator's job was to catch the magician. So far he had lost and the magician had won. He could only hope that next time he would win and the magician would lose. One of the most harmful aspects of the challenge approach is that it undermines the illusion of magic. Every time Slidini chided a spectator for not catching him, he reminded the audience that there was something to catch, that it wasn't really magic. Every time John Ramsey faked a palm, then showed his hand empty, he reminded the viewer that he was just watching tricks that depended on things like palming. Such an approach is not likely to give an audience a sense of wonder at having seen an impossibility. It's more likely to leave them with a sense of frustration at having been outwitted. The challenge approach relates to the puzzle mentality we'll be discussing in a moment. Puzzles have solutions. We may not know what the solution is, but we know there is one. Magic, on the other hand, is, by definition, an eternal mystery for which there is no possible solution. Therefore, it doesn't make any sense to challenge the audience to find a solution. I suspect there may be something about performing for other magicians that tends to promote a challenge style. Is it just a coincidence that John Ramsey, another of the legendary close-up magicians of this century, also built his style around the challenge approach, relying on the constant use of feints and sucker moves to rub his audience's noses in the fact that he was fooling them? Ramsey would even taunt spectators by following a coin vanish with the comment, "You don't know where the coin is, do you, laddie?" Of course, Ramsey made his living running a grocery store. If you want to pattern your performing approach after one of this century's legendary magicians, I suggest that a better model is Fred Capps, a magician who made his living performing for the public. You'll recall his advice was, "There is no place for challenge in professional magic." I want to make it clear that what I am advising against is a challenging attitude on the part of the performer. There is, for example, nothing wrong with presenting an effect under challenge conditions. You must, however, make it clear by your attitude that you're challenging yourself to succeed under impossible conditions. You're not challenging the audience to catch you. Similarly, any apparent impossibility poses an implicit challenge to an audience to find a natural explanation. In magic, effects that involve repetition, such as the ambitious card, a one-at-a-time ace assembly, or a repeat oil and water routine, particularly pose a challenge to the audience to figure them out. With each new repetition, they consider new theories and are forced to reject them. This process of implicitly making the audience consider every possible explanation until they finally have to accept that there is no explanation can be an extremely effective way of leading them to embrace the impossible. Just what magic should be all about. Juan Tamariz explores this concept in The Magic Way. Just make sure the challenge comes from the impossibility you present, not from your own attitude. Your attitude should be that there is no explanation to be sought. It's just magic. The puzzle mentality. I've never dealt with whodunits. They're simply clever puzzles, aren't they? They're intellectual rather than emotional, and emotion is the only thing that keeps my audiences interested. Alfred Hitchcock. When I was about 9 years old, I got a children's magic set. Along with paddle tricks and all the other slum magic that formed the standard magic set fare, it also included about a half-dozen wire puzzles. I remember wondering what these were doing in the set, since I knew that puzzles and magic weren't the same thing. This simple truth that any 9-year-old instinctively knows is one that many magicians fail to realize. A magical effect may be very puzzling, but it's not a puzzle. A puzzle admits of a possible solution, at least in theory. True magic admits of no possible solution. It's an eternal mystery. Even more important, a puzzle is strictly an intellectual challenge with no emotions element, unless you count the frustration. Emotionless intellect is precisely what we want to avoid in magic. As we've just seen, challenge is another good thing to avoid in magic. The only satisfaction of a puzzle comes from solving it. The satisfaction of the spectator must come in part from not solving it. A sign of the prevalence of this puzzle mentality in magic is the habit some cardmen have of referring to every plot for a trick as a card problem and every effect employing that plot as a solution to the problem. Constructing a magical effect usually involves solving many problems, just as writing a novel may require solving many problems of plot, characterization, and style. Yet, no writer would ever refer to his plot as a problem and the finished novel as the solution. The very problem or solution terminology suggests a desire to reduce the creative process to an intellectual exercise. The artistic process, whether in creating effects or presentations, is much more complex than that. The failure to clearly distinguish between magic and puzzles is one of the most pernicious, as well as one of the most pervasive trends in magic. My own field of card magic is particularly plagued by this problem. In Ibidem, number 21, Norm Houghton speaks of amateur mathematicians who have somehow acquired the quaint delusion that their hobby is magic. Unfortunately, the accusation is only too true. The problem stems in part from the fact that many magicians are also puzzle fans. In fact, during the short history of close-up magic, a number of well-known practitioners have also been prominent puzzle experts. Many magic magazines also publish puzzles from time to time. With this dual love in the bosoms of so many magicians, it's little wonder they sometimes get the two confused. It also makes it difficult for them to recognize that most people don't like puzzles. In fact, many people hate them. I'm not very fond of puzzles myself. It probably goes back to getting gypped on that magic set. I think that as a magician, I'm fortunate in this regard. This attitude brings me closer to the viewpoint of most lay people, something that every magician should strive for. If you're one of those magicians who likes puzzles, you're going to have to be particularly alert to the danger of allowing your magic to degenerate into mere puzzles. Strive to give your audiences impossibilities rather than puzzles. Let them experience wonder rather than frustration. The illusion of impossibility. There is a world of difference between a spectator's not knowing how something's done versus his knowing that it can't be done. Simon Aronson, The Aronson Approach. An interesting difference between performing for magicians and performing for laypeople is that, if a magician succeeds in figuring out 90% of a trick, but can't figure out the other 10%, he will feel that the trick fooled him. If a lay person succeeds in figuring out 10% of a trick, but can't figure out the other 90% of the trick, he will feel that it didn't fool him. The magician will think, I know how he controlled my card to the top of the deck, and I saw him palm the card, but I don't know how he got it between those two plastic sheets that were taped together on all sides. He really fooled me. The layperson will think, he didn't fool me. I saw him palm the card. This attitude on the part of lay audiences frustrates some magicians who are inclined to respond, yeah, but how did I locate your card in the first place? And how did I get it between the plastic sheets? The layperson's response will be something like, oh, you got it in there somehow, but you didn't fool me. I saw the card in your hand. Which attitude is correct? That of magician audiences or lay audiences? It depends on whether you feel that magic is supposed to be a puzzle or an apparent impossibility. Suppose a person is putting together a 100-piece jigsaw puzzle. He gets 90 pieces into place, but can't get the last 10 pieces to fit. He will feel that he failed to solve the puzzle. Suppose you're watching something that is allegedly achieved by supernatural means. You spot some wires that are obviously being manipulated from off stage. You may not know exactly what those wires have to do with what you're seeing, but you know they must have something to do with it. You also know that supernatural phenomena don't require wires. You weren't fooled. You saw the wires. The question in the magician spectator's mind is, what is the explanation? The question in the lay spectator's mind is there an explanation? Therefore, to move a layperson, you must do something far more difficult than fooling him. You must create an illusion of impossibility. I would go so far as to say that the illusion of impossibility is as good a definition of what constitutes magic as I can imagine. Of course, creating an illusion is far more difficult than merely puzzling someone. A magical illusion is the most fragile thing in the world. It's like a delicate soap bubble that can be burst by sharp objects, sudden jostling, or even a gust of wind. Since most magicians will always choose the easiest path rather than the most effective, you can expect that most of your magician friends will settle for doing puzzles. If you choose the path of self-discipline rather than indulgence, you'll have to work very hard to master the technique taught in this book in order to nurture the illusion of impossibility. Reaching the emotions. One may disbelieve with his mind, yet still believe with his blood. Edward Wagenknecht. Probably the key reason why many magicians lack faith in magic as entertainment is the feeling that magic has lost its hold over modern audiences because people no longer believe in magic as a literal reality. Let's examine this matter of belief more closely, since it's fundamental to understanding the role of showmanship in magic. It's become fashionable among those few magicians who even bother to discuss showmanship, to talk about getting audiences to willingly suspend their disbelief. This phrase was first coined by Samuel Taylor Coleridge to refer to the attitude required of theater audiences. While quite apt in that context, it's not really appropriate to magic. To understand why, let's contrast the attitude of a theater-going audience to that of a spectator watching close-up magic. A person goes to a performance of J.M. Barrie's play, Peter Pan. He knows that people can't fly, and he knows that the actor portraying Peter Pan is not really flying through the air. In order to enjoy the play, however, he is going to have to pretend that a person can fly and forget he is watching an actor suspended by wires. Since the wires are visible to anyone who looks hard enough, the spectator must do this willingly, or the play won't work for him. By contrast, consider a spectator watching a magician make a dollar bill float through the air. The spectator could willingly suspend his disbelief and pretend that dollar bills can float. If he did that, it wouldn't matter if he saw the thread attached to the bill, any more than it matters that he can see the wires attached to Peter Pan. However, if he took that attitude, the magic wouldn't have much impact on him. The floating bill is strong magic precisely because the spectator will not willingly believe that bills can float. It's the fact that his intellect doesn't want to believe, yet his senses force him to, that gives the magic its power. Yet, it's also true that in order for close-up magic to be effective, the spectator must become a co-conspirator with the performer in pulling off the scam. Here we come to a paradox that is central to understanding the power of magic as entertainment. Most people have an intellectual resistance to believing in the impossible, while at the same time having an emotional desire to believe in the impossible. It is this tension at the heart of the human spirit that strong magic evokes. The result is the wonder and awe that magic always generates. So forget about creating willing suspension of disbelief. Get your audience to actually believe in magic. Intellectual versus emotional belief. It sounds like an impossible goal, doesn't it? How can you make a sophisticated modern audience believe in magic? You can't if talking about intellectual belief. I'm talking about emotional belief. An anecdote from the 19th century perfectly captures the difference between intellectual belief and emotional belief. Madame de Defaune was asked whether she believed in ghosts. She responded, "No, but I am afraid of them." The impact of a magic effect is directly proportional to the degree to which it engages the emotions of the spectator. The reaction to strong magic is always emotional. Poker expert Mike Carroll once said, "Losers exaggerate how much money they lost. That's because they're not trying to convey what really happened so much as how bad they feel." This is also why lay people often exaggerate a magic effect when they describe it to another. They're not really trying to communicate what happened. They're trying to convey the emotion they felt when they witnessed it. If the impact of magic is on the emotions, it follows that your presentations have to be designed to reach the emotions. The problem is that the intellect always attempts to protect the emotions. It's like a guard standing before a set of iron gates. When you show someone an apparent impossibility, before he can get emotionally excited, his intellect will say, "Wait a minute, I can figure this out." There has to be a rational explanation. It's only when his intellect surrenders and admits that there is no explanation that the gates swing open and you can reach his emotions. If an effect is properly structured, that whole process may take a split second. Therefore, if you want to reach the spectator's emotions, you first have to literally baffle his intellect. Leave it without any possible explanation. Certainly, you will never achieve intellectual belief with an audience. They will always know in the backs of their minds that there's really no such thing as magic. However, when you succeed in baffling their intellects by creating strong conviction, you will achieve emotional belief. On a gut level, they will react as if the magic is real. Remember Madame de Dauphin? She knew intellectually that ghosts don't exist, but that didn't prevent her from reacting on an emotional level as if they did. Narrative art. Unlike static art forms like painting, sculpture, and photography, and purely expressive art forms like music and dance, magic is a narrative art form. This simply means that magic tells a story. I'm not here referring to the fact that some magical presentations use a story to accompany the effect. I mean that every effect is itself a story, regardless of the presentation accompanying it. Like any story, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. As with any narrative art, the audience watches because it wants to find out what will happen next. When a spectator watches a magic trick, he is witnessing, and sometimes participating in, a story. The story of what happens in the magic trick. This means that part of magic presentation technique is narrative technique. It is concerned with considerations of theme, characterization, conflict, plotting, storyline, clarity, atmosphere, and dramatic structure. These are the same considerations that are central to all narrative arts: film, theater, fiction, and storytelling. I stress this because, as obvious as the point is, it has received very little attention in magic literature. Therefore, this way of thinking is likely to strike many readers as strange. In developing the concepts explored in this book, I'll often employ analogies to other narrative arts and cite principles that are accepted as axiomatic in all other narrative arts, yet hardly recognized in magic. I think that as we go along, you'll come to appreciate that the better you understand the principles of narrative art, generally, the more effective you'll be as a magical entertainer. While every magic trick tells a story, it's important to realize that the prime goal of magic is not to tell a story, but to create a sensation. I mention this because, in addition to Fitzky's fallacy, another common error is what I call the theatrical fallacy. Some of the magicians and magical writers most concerned with presentation make the mistake of thinking that the point of a magic effect is to support a dramatic premise, much like theatrical effects or film special effects do. This, for example, is a flaw in Henning Nelm's otherwise outstanding magic and showmanship. Not surprisingly, Nelms's background was in theater. If, however, our fundamental premise is correct, that the unique strength of magic is that it gives the audience the experience of confronting the impossible, it follows that the point of a dramatic presentation is to enhance the magic. The magic is not there to validate a dramatic premise. The dramatic premise is used to add impact to the magic, to make the experience of the impossible that much more powerful. With these thoughts in the backs of our minds, I think we're ready to leave theory, roll up our sleeves, and plunge into technique. Darwin Ortiz, Strong Magic, 1994. Darwin Ortiz. Darwin Ortiz is known as an authority on both magic and gambling, and his creative output with a pack of cards has been staggering. In 1994, he raised many eyebrows with Strong Magic, and in the ensuing time it has taken its place in the pantheon of the very best magic books ever written. Ortiz challenged many classic theories in magic and codified many new ones. Performing Principles by Arturo de Ascanio. Let's now delve into the three performance principles: timing, misdirection, and technique. Timing. In-transit actions. Timing, a basic principle of magic, is about executing each action at the right time with the right intensity and giving it the right degree of importance. It's difficult to assess and to clarify, let alone establish general rules for it. With some effort, however, I have managed to establish a premise that can be instrumental to the understanding of timing, namely the distinction between final actions and in-transit actions. In a group of gestures, there's a moment when the main gesture, which we'll call the final action, is done. It is the one that motivates all other gestures, which are passing gestures, which we'll call in-transit actions. In-transit actions lead to the final one. Secret actions, thus, must always be executed within the flow of an in-transit action and never during the final action. One must always look for in-transit actions in which to include the slights. The notion of what for is what identifies an in-transit action. The cards are picked up in order to show them, for example. To pick up the cards is an in-transit action in order to show them. The essence of timing lies in accentuating final actions and executing slights within the in-transit actions. Misdirection. Now we're going to discuss misdirection from a practical, not technical point of view. One of the main principles of misdirection is what we can call the law of interest. A spectator watching magic, just as a spectator of everyday life, only sees from among all that surrounds him, that which for some reason captures his attention and interest at that moment. There is always something that interests us, and that's why we pay attention to it. The eye is constantly moving and our brain is translating what the eye sees. But every so often, for some reason, the brain becomes interested in something. This is the general psychological foundation of misdirection. A concrete application of this is what I call the law of primary motion, that can be set forth as follows. When two objects begin to move within a visual field, the human eye tends to follow the first one to initiate movement. The second one to move stays in the shaded area, so to speak, of the spectator's gaze. Therefore, generally speaking, when a secret action is to be executed, one should begin another movement earlier with the other hand. Another chief aspect here is the coordination of the gaze with gestures and patter. The gaze should be directed to the point we want the spectator to look at, to a point where nothing secret is going on, because secret actions are taking place elsewhere. Aside from physical or material misdirection caused by shifting the gaze, patter coordinated with gestures is the ideal vehicle for mental misdirection. Another aspect of misdirection is what I call its darkening feature. Since spectators are continually formulating thoughts and reacting to what they see, we can make thoughts emerge in their minds that darken what is happening right before their eyes. It turns out that the mind works in such a way that when we're thinking about one thing, we cannot think of another at the same time. When we listen to the radio, we cannot concentrate on what we're reading, and if we focus on what we're reading, we cannot hear what is being said on the radio. The magician can take advantage of this by putting such ideas in the spectator's mind, cluttering it with innocent thoughts, and making use of that darkness to perform a secret action. You can take advantage of moments of astonishment or surprise, as they lock into the spectator's mind, preventing it from analyzing what is happening at the same or almost at the same time. Technique. Let's touch on some aspects of technique. Lightness. Good technique, of course, is that which does not seem to exist. Aside from timing and misdirection, another contributing factor is lightness of movement. Heavy technique is bad. Cards should be almost loose in the hand. Relaxation is essential. Beauty. Technique has an external aspect which can be pleasant or unpleasant, pretty or ugly. Therefore, this external aspect should be studied carefully. We should aim for smoothness, for a sensation of beauty in the way the cards or the objects used are handled in order to achieve an aesthetically pleasing result. Breadth of movement. Finally, one of the aspects of beautiful technique is breadth of movement. Movements should not be short. Beauty must have breadth. Arturo de Ascanio. The Magic of Ascanio, 2005. Some background on Arturo de Ascanio. Arturo de Ascanio, 1929 to 1997, is considered the father of modern Spanish magic, and this title has become all the more significant as Spain rises to the apex of cutting-edge magic. Ascanio's influence is prevalent in the work of his star pupil, Juan Tamariz. Ascanio's essay on performing principles set the curriculum for the remainder of our discussion in this section. He talks of three elements: timing, misdirection, and technique. Let's shift our focus to timing. Ascanio already discussed timing as it occurs during a sleight or trick. What about the timing of a trick's plot? Darwin Ortiz explores new theoretical territory with his seminal essay on what he calls the critical interval. The Critical Interval by Darwin Ortiz. The fundamental tension in creating strong magic effects is the struggle between proximity and distance. The method, because it must obey the laws of nature, requires proximity. The effect, because it must appear to defy the laws of nature, requires distance. Fortunately, there are a variety of techniques that, applied creatively, can reconcile these opposing demands. Let's begin by considering how to build a temporal wall between method and effect. The critical interval. What is the most dangerous moment in any effect in which to perform trickery? Most magicians would probably answer, when the audience is watching most closely. This answer, however, only raises the question, when is the audience going to be watching most closely? To answer that question, we have to return to Ascanio's definition of a magic effect. You'll recall that it is the difference between the initial condition and the final condition. If you're going to change an apple into an orange, showing the apple is the initial condition and revealing the orange is the final condition. These roughly correspond to what in strong magic I call the expository phase and the magical phase. For discussing presentation, I think those terms are more useful. For discussing effect design, I think Ascanio's terms are more useful. The riskiest moment for trickery is the time between the audience's last view of the initial condition and their first view of the final condition. If you have to cover the apple with a handkerchief to change it into an orange, the danger period extends from the moment you cover the apple to the moment you uncover the orange. This time period is so central to all our subsequent discussions that it deserves a name. I call it the critical interval. The critical interval is the time between the audience's last view of the initial condition and their first view of the final condition. Depending on the effect, the critical interval can range from a fraction of a second to several minutes. In a color change, the period from the audience's final view of one card to its first view of the other card may be hardly more than the blink of an eye. At the other end of the spectrum, consider the classic card in ring box, as I employ it in my 9-card location. I start by taking out the ring box and placing it in front of a spectator. I instruct her not to take her eyes off it. I then have the selections made, the last of which a spectator signs. After these are lost in the deck, I locate each one in turn. Lastly, the signed card is found folded inside the ring box. Thus, for the card in ring box portion of the effect, the critical interval lasts from the moment the signed card is lost in the deck to the moment it's found in the box, a period of about 7 minutes. Whether short or long, the critical interval looms large in the thinking of any audience watching a magic effect. If the initial condition differs from the final condition, common sense dictates that whatever caused the change happened during the critical interval. And remember, common sense is what lay people rely on when reacting to a magic effect. The critical interval is when an audience expects the method to happen. If you doubt that, consider this. One of the best comments you can ever hope to hear at the end of an effect is, "But he didn't do anything." If the spectator concludes that you didn't do anything, the next thing he will conclude is, "That's impossible." Because if you didn't do anything, there is no cause to account for the effect. But what does a spectator really mean when he says that you didn't do anything? He does not, of course, mean that you never did anything at any point from the beginning of the effect to the end. That would certainly make for a dull performance. You took out the apple. You held up the apple. Perhaps you handed the apple out for examination. You covered the apple. You whisked away the cover to reveal the orange. Perhaps you handed the orange out for examination. All of these things constitute doing something. Yet he emphatically proclaims that you didn't do anything. What the astonished spectator really means is that you didn't do anything during the critical interval between his last view of the apple and his first view of the orange. In the audience's mind, this is the only time that matters. If you didn't do anything then, you didn't do anything. This works the other way also. A spectator may dismiss a trick by saying merely, "You did something." This sort of response frustrates many magicians. They feel that the spectator should be required to either spell out exactly what the magician did or admit defeat. This would be true if we were speaking of a puzzle. However, if the spectator senses that you did something during the critical interval, it's not magic. This is one of the reasons why magic happening in a spectator's hands can be so powerful. If the audience believes that the entire critical interval transpired while the key object was under the spectator's control, you have a miracle. Since the critical interval plays such a vital role in the audience's thinking, it had better play a vital role in your thinking. The less you do during the critical interval, the stronger the effect will be. This is why your instincts may sometimes tell you that, in a particular trick, the crucial move comes at the wrong time. If you don't fully understand the problem analytically, you might conclude that the solution is to add misdirection to cover the move. If, however, the flaw exists on the design level, adding misdirection will be like painting over cracks in a building caused by a poor foundation. A move comes at the wrong time if it comes when the audience is expecting it. Audiences expect the trickery to happen during the critical interval. Everything you do during that period will be scrutinized more closely, both at the time and in retrospect. If the trickery really does happen during the critical interval, the weakest solution is to try to cover it with misdirection. The strongest solution is to redesign the method. Darwin Ortiz, Designing Miracles, 2006. Misdirection. For 1,000 years, magicians have come to define misdirection in basically the same way, making a spectator look away from a particular place. The following essay is revolutionary. It reimagines and renames the concept of misdirection. Direction, Tommy Wonder tells us, does not start and stop with a secret move, but is a continuous, flowing strategy used in every moment of performance. And we must train ourselves not to think of misdirection as shifting attention away from something secret, but instead toward something of interest. Getting the Miss Out of Misdirection by Tommy Wonder with Stephen Minch. Misdirection. So much is written about it. So much is said about it. Often when spectators talk with magicians, you hear, "I'll bet you misdirected me, didn't you?" For we readily confess to using misdirection, and it is true. It is one of the strongest and most interesting tools we have. Many, although unfortunately not all, magicians will admit this. However, do you use it to sometimes confess to your spectators? Do you use it as much as you should? Are you really using it at all? Outside, inside. I suppose that there are several reasons readily cited to account at least in part for why misdirection is not used to the extent it should be. But even with those who do use it consistently and are very aware of its power, I often sense that its entire benefit is not reaped. That we are not always deriving from this tool the full strength and illusion it can provide. I think this occurs because misdirection is often applied as it is learned. As you discover certain things, characteristics of certain misdirectional ploys, those ploys are used wherever they seem suitable. Often, though, such applications are not suitable at all. Let me explain. The usual way to understand something new is to approach it from the outside. Often that's the only way. From the outside, we examine the subject and probe more and more deeply into it, and at the same time, our understanding of it should grow. When examining misdirection, it doesn't take long to find out that there are all kinds of link systems, ploys, tricks of the trade. For instance, have something happen away from the secret. Ask a question. If you want the audience to look at an object, look at it yourself. Look them in the eye if you want them to look at you. Make them laugh. Take advantage of relaxation. On examining successful misdirection, one will find that these things, these tricks of the trade, work. And it is logical, then, to use them, or at least try to use them to cover up weaknesses or perilous moments in your work. Do you have to palm a card? Ask someone a question, and while they are busy answering, bingo, you palm the card. Problem solved. Do you need to load a cup? Say something funny. They will laugh and you can safely load that lemon. Once again, problem solved. Isn't misdirection great? This method of applying the tricks of misdirection, which your study has shown to be effective in the performances and writings of other magicians, may seem valid. And yes, properly applied, all these different techniques will definitely work. They will help to hide the weak spots, discrepancies, secrets, unnatural procedures. But is this the best approach? Is it best to examine your routine, find the weak or dangerous spots, then plaster over each of them with some form of misdirection? Although this approach can do what you ask of it, distracting from the defects of your method, I doubt that such a path will yield the finest results possible. Undoubtedly, misdirection can offer such services in abundance. However, by applying it in this way, you use only a sliver of its potential. Aren't we merely patching up leaky holes in a less than perfect trick or routine? Of course, patching such holes will prevent the boat from sinking, which is always better than going down. But wouldn't it be better to build your boat without holes in the first place? Won't that give more artistically satisfying results right from the start? In magic, you have an effect, an ideal. Maintaining this ideal, originally pristine and beautiful, is difficult if, before even the first performance, you find holes that need patching with extraneous ploys. Such an approach originates from outside. Misdirection is used as an external measure, a tool divorced from the effect. Thus it cannot be an integral element of the procedure, woven naturally into the original design. I believe that, in such circumstances, you will have an extremely difficult time devising misdirection that functions logically and naturally within the envisioned effect. At one point, Slidini speaks of magic as a piece of cloth. When creating a presentation, you weave your cloth using misdirection as just one of the threads. It is then fully part of the whole, integrated. The misdirection is woven in during the initial designing. This is much different from weaving a cloth, then discovering that there are one or two holes in it, and sewing those holes closed with an extra thread. The result is a cloth without true beauty, for the mended parts will probably be a little rough and stiff. The cloth won't have the beautiful feel and texture it could have. It stands to reason that mending weak parts afterward can only result in a patched piece of work. Studying misdirection only to find little strategies that you might use will surely give you a means to strengthen your magic. This can't be denied. However, I believe there is another way, one that will unleash far more power for you, and one that offers far better chances of achieving something of real beauty. This other way, an inside approach, is not easier or faster than the usual outside approach, and therefore might be considered less practical by some. In the beginning, this inside approach will take more time and effort. Indeed, at first it may seem hopelessly difficult. But once you get used to it and have gone through the process several times, it becomes easier. It will never be as easy as the usual method of patching up your work with misdirection. But then again, the results will please you more. I am certain that with an inside approach you can achieve misdirection that is woven naturally into your routines, an integral part of them, inseparable and far more artistically sound, and falling short of true artistry, at the least they will be more subtle, more devious, and more effective. In addition, you will find them incredibly easy to execute and with greater protection against failure. Sound promising? Perhaps, then, we should have a look at this inside approach. However, I must ask for your patience. Before we can see how an inside approach can work, we must first gain a clear understanding of the different factors that affect misdirection. We must first study the often used systems, the standard tricks of misdirection. I will not attempt to make a complete analysis of all the ploys available. Other books have already done that in an admirable way. Fitzke's book, Magic by Misdirection, although written in the 1940s, is still a monumental work on this subject. Henning Nelms, in his Magic and Showmanship, has some very important things to say as well. I can only advise you to study these texts along with other books on the topic, the performances of other magicians, your own experiences, and most important, your own observations. What I will discuss here are various ideas of mine, some of which I believe differ to some degree from those already published, and some of which I have never read anywhere else. I will also make some general observations that offer no fresh concepts in themselves, but are necessary to understand ensuing ideas that are new. But I repeat, I make no attempt at completeness. Let's first approach this great invisible beast from the outside. Let's dissect it, tear it apart, analyze it, consider it, and try to understand it. Then, when we understand the parts sufficiently, we'll unite them again, enabled by our understanding to play with their union, since it has become a part of ourselves. We can start, armed with a thorough understanding of the elements involved, and with an approach from the inside to create the most elegant, artistic, and effective misdirection imaginable. At least it is the most beautiful formulation of misdirection that I can conceive. Misdirection. Okay, let's begin at the beginning. Misdirection. It's truly unfortunate that in magic we have many terms and expressions that don't accurately reflect what they are intended to do. This is a pity because the use of correct terminology helps to keep one's thinking straight and greatly simplifies matters when magicians communicate with each other. One of our more serious misnomers is the word misdirection. Misdirection implies wrong direction. It suggests that attention is directed away from something. By constantly using this term, it eventually becomes so ingrained in our minds that we might start to perceive misdirection as directing attention away from rather than toward something. Newcomers to magic will almost certainly think along such incorrect lines, because we have chosen a word that promotes this misconception. Let me try to explain with an example why misdirection should never be a diverting of attention from something. Suppose I say, I want to get out of the city for the weekend. Here I have not said where I will go, only that it will not be in the city. The city, where I won't be, gets all the attention in my sentence, and the place I will go gets none. If I said instead that I wished to go to a specific village for the weekend, I wouldn't be speaking of the city at all, but only of the village I intend to visit. When I go to this village, I naturally won't be in the city, but no attention is focused on the city. Attention is properly placed on the village to which I will travel. The sentence becomes a positive one, carrying a positive meaning directed at the village. Let's now translate this into magical terms. Let's assume you wish to do a trick in which you palm a card from the deck using your right hand. While you are palming the card, you want to direct the audience's attention from the right hand. All your efforts are concentrated on getting attention off the right hand. Off the right hand. Off the right hand. And in your mind, all you are thinking about is your right hand. It's hard for you to forget that hand, and your audience may sense your concern and concentration on your hand. They may actually become intent, just like you are, on your right hand, and then they will see you palm the card. However, now imagine that you use your left hand to move a glass to your kit on the table while you palm the card. Now, don't try to direct attention away from the right hand. Instead, direct all attention to your left hand as it moves the glass. Don't worry if someone is watching your right hand. Forget it. Don't be concerned about it. Concentrate instead on the glass, on how you grasp it, where you move it, etc. Now your mind is entirely focused on the glass, and you will actually be able to forget that the right hand is palming a card. This is a much more positive approach than the previous one, and it results in there being no attention on your right hand. Your attention and the attention of the audience will be on the glass. It is said, and I believe it to be true, that the subconscious mind is capable only of taking in the positive meaning of things. This is due to its ability to think in concrete pictures rather than abstract words. Words have no power in your mind. Imagining something with words alone is hard, perhaps impossible. For instance, imagine that you wish to ask your employer for a raise. Mentally, though, you envision his telling you no and dismissing you from his office. As you picture this scene, you can say to yourself, "I don't want that to happen." But your mind pushes this denial aside and continues to see your failure. This mental picture can shape future reality, resulting in your actually being denied the raise. This occurs because the scene of failure you have imagined causes you to behave a bit nervously, perhaps, or unsure of yourself. Little, uncontrollable things which convey to your employer an impression that you aren't sure yourself if you deserve a raise. This naturally makes it easy for him to dismiss the idea. Essentially, the same thing occurs when you are concentrating on your right hand and the card it must palm. The picture is there, containing your fear of the palmed card being seen, and consequently uncontrollable signs produced by your fear betray you. Palmed card to be detected. Returning to our example of the raise, imagine that you were now to concentrate on a positive scenario. You see your employer agreeing with you that you deserve a raise, after which he grants it. This mental picture helps to produce behavior in you that broadcasts different signals. Behind your actual conversation, there now lies an impression that your employer will give you the raise, and he will sense this confidence through subtle details. Consequently, he will find it more difficult to deny the raise, since your attitude has made it easier for him to perceive your request as a reasonable one. The chances of your getting the raise are much greater. This is nothing more than the power of positive thinking. People are generally pushed in the direction that takes the least effort on their parts. In magic, this translates into adhering only to positive ideas. Negative approaches, like that of directing attention away from your hand as it palms a card, only create negative pictures that fulfill themselves, drawing attention to the hand. It is much better to use a positive picture, like that of your other hand moving the glass. Such pictures are also self-fulfilling. The idea is quite simple. Misdirection must be attention directed towards something, not away from something, and positive images are the way to achieve this. Directing attention from is a hopeless and virtually impossible approach. The moment you start trying to misdirect, the battle is lost. It would be far better for us if misdirection had not become an accepted term in magic, and direction had been adopted instead. Alas, misdirection long ago became so common a term, I don't think we'll ever be able to replace it with direction. Well, you're right. That is very negative thinking on my part. Okay, yes, we will be able to replace the word misdirection with the more precise word direction. Something of interest. For our secret moves to avoid unwanted attention, we must direct attention towards something else. From this, it follows that we must have something else available at those times, something of interest. The more interesting this certain something is, the easier it will be to focus attention on it. The next time you wish to hide something, don't think of hiding it, but rather think of what you can offer of interest in its place. Preferably, this should be something thoroughly intriguing. The concept of offering something of greater interest is, although simple, an important and essential step in hiding your secrets. I believe it is ignorance of this concept that has caused many magicians to fail in what they thought was misdirection. Presenting something of greater interest that attracts attention, rather than trying to direct attention away from your secret, is a much more dependable way to protect that secret. This is a key concept, and if it hasn't already become an automatic part of your thinking, Making it one could well be the single most productive step you can take toward a more successful use of attention control. Many know this concept. Some even apply it. However, it is so easy to forget because it is so simple. It is like the gasoline in your car. Without it, you will not get far. You must have something of interest to offer. While the importance of this concept cannot be emphasized enough, it is nevertheless only the first step in hiding your secrets. There is another well-known but often ignored principle, a major principle that has many other benefits. Continuous direction. Continuous direction. In legitimate theater, techniques for directing attention are constantly used. Not, of course, to hide a multitude of little secrets. No. These techniques are used to present the story in a clear and uncluttered manner. No matter what you perform, there will always be countless little things that are there out of necessity, though they bear no importance to the plot or idea presented. Many things must happen to get the story across effectively, but it isn't important for the audience to perceive those things, because they simply aren't significant to the plot. For an audience to follow the story, you don't want to bother them with details of stagecraft. You want only to impress on them those elements that matter. Nothing more, nothing less. When we perform as magicians, our job consists of more than simply hiding the secret. That is just a small part of our objective. Much more important is that we highlight the important details, those things that are necessary if the audience is to understand and follow the action and its intended meaning. You should be giving your spectators an uncluttered impression of the effect. We want to enhance the most interesting and important points, to paint a clear picture in the spectators' minds. Only then can they appreciate what we are trying to convey to them. Simply stated, we must present our work in a clear and efficient way if it is to be effective. To do this, it is necessary for us to point out only the important details, to display them, to throw a strong light on them. It is only logical that we should direct the audience's attention continuously, from one important point to the next. If this isn't done, attention may stray to something unimportant, which may complicate or confuse the information the audience receives. Therefore, from the first moment of our work to the last, the instant an important point has been digested by the spectators, the next important point should be presented to them, all without the intrusion of clutter and unimportant detail. Continuous direction is essential if we are to create sound theater. We can't do without it. Since magic is theater as well, it needs continuous direction as much as any other theatrical form. With continuous direction, we control the attention of the audience, focusing where we want it by presenting a series of important and relevant ideas and occurrences. Believing in your own magic. Often I've read advice in our books that one should just forget the sleight or gimmick. The best way to use a thumb tip? Just forget that it is on your thumb. Afraid of palming a card? Forget that you have it palmed. Now, this advice certainly seems valid. It might be very beneficial if you could forget you are doing a sleight or forget that thumb tip on your thumb. But this advice doesn't offer much real help, does it? It instructs that you consciously forget. How on earth does one do that? Forget on purpose. Just one attempt will be enough to convince you that such a thing is impossible. However, this laudable but impossible idea of forgetting provides an excellent case for the practice of structuring your performances as a string of highlights. Focus attention on something other than the secret, and the audience will pay no attention to the secret. But just as importantly, it correctly directs your attention as well. One cannot purposely forget, but you can substitute one thought for another. If you don't want to think of something else. The trick is not to forget the thumb tip. The trick is to think of something else while you wear the thumb tip. And if there is a strong point of interest, you can place your interest there as well. It can and should be so strong a point that it will make you think of the important and relevant features of presentation, the highlights only, and this makes it impossible for distracting thoughts concerning method to enter your mind. Your conscious mind is completely occupied with the important aspects of the effect. No place is left in it for you to think about the secret, and the secret is pushed into the shade of your subconscious mind. When you do this, you can deceive yourself. Of course, it takes practice. You might not succeed the first time you try, at home, but if you really concentrate, if you force yourself while practicing to think only about the highlights of the presentation, soon thoughts concerning method will slip into the safe darkness of your subconscious. You simply won't have time to think about slights and gimmicks, as your thoughts will be too engaged for such things. To learn to believe your own magic, apart from good direction, you will need a solid, silent script. The silent script, a basic acting tool, is well described by Henning Nelms in Magic and Showmanship. A silent script correctly grounds your acting. While it is formally an acting tool, it also helps you to avoid undesirable thoughts concerning method. This idea of replacing certain thoughts with others may sound a bit mystical at first, but it is practical and not particularly difficult. However, it isn't automatic. It must be practiced. Otherwise, when you execute some secret action, before you know it, a thought about this action will appear in your mind. But if you practice, while seriously concentrating, to supplant such thoughts with presentational ones, eventually the divorcing of secret actions from thoughts about them will become easier and easier. And eventually, this detachment from method will work for you during actual performances as well. You must, though, stick to your silent script during practice. If you attempt to use a silent script only during your shows, you will have trouble. Only thorough practice with the silent script will produce the desired results. From this, you will see that there must not be only continuous direction, but continuous thinking as well. Tommy Wonder, The Books of Wonder, 1996. We return once more to Maestro Ascanio, who picks up where Tommy Wonder left off in our discussion of misdirection. Sorry, Tommy, I meant direction. Ascanio coined the term in-transit action, and here he takes us through his most famous insight into magic theory. This specific technique incorporates all three elements he outlined previously in this audiobook and puts them to harmonious work: timing, misdirection, and technique. In-Transit Actions by Arturo de Ascanio. This is where I've discovered, not invented, a generic category of secondary actions that, as such, serve to create a coordinated cover for secret actions. I have called them in-transit actions. In-transit actions are those that are done in passing and are required for the completion of a more important main action. Let's say a man wants to take a pack of cigarettes out of his right pocket, but his right hand is holding an ordinary object such as a pen. In order to take the pack of cigarettes, he needs his right hand free. Therefore, in order to take the cigarettes, in transit to the action of taking them, he transfers the pen to his left hand so his free right hand can enter the pocket and take out the cigarettes. The spectator only sees the main action, taking out the cigarettes, because the in-transit action of transferring the pen to the other hand is so taken for granted and so embedded in the main act that it, by itself, has no interest whatsoever. Countless details in this in-transit action, such as turning the pen end for end or taking it one way or another in the left hand, would go unnoticed for the same reason. Elements of in-transit actions. We can already conclude that in-transit actions combine the following elements. A final action that appears as the main one. That's the action that gives meaning to the whole group of gestures that come before and after, thus converting them into the preliminaries and the result of the main action. This final action, needless to say, must not be a secret one. It should be an honest action that is not related to the result of the trick. A secondary action which is done as a mere procedural step towards completion of the main action. This is the in-transit action proper. The gesture that embodies it must not have a meaning by itself. This action should be simple, brief, and inconspicuous. It is during this action that the secret action takes place. A manifestation, however subtle, of the fact that the performer's intention is to execute the main action. I think this is the most important element because it's the magician's attitude that makes some gestures seem important while others are perceived merely as secondary, routine gestures. Arturo de Ascanio, The Magic of Ascanio, 2005. Ascanio spoke of three elements: timing, misdirection, and technique. In this section of the audiobook, we have covered timing and misdirection in great detail. All that remains is a thorough discussion on technique, and there is no magician alive more qualified to speak on the subject than John Carney. Carney achieved excellence in magic by focused practicing, and this is no surprise. Aristotle wrote, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit. Yet practice is an art unto itself. Everyone tells us to practice, but nobody tells us how. Until now. Practice and Technique by John Carney. From the beginning, we have heard that the three rules of magic are practice, practice, practice. But what does practice entail? How do we approach it? How do we know we are practicing correctly? How can we get the most from our practice? Practice is more than just a matter of getting through the allotted time without dropping anything or losing your place. Practice is more than repetition, more than memorizing a sequence, or mastering a particular sleight. In a nutshell, progress comes from being constructively critical of your work and making adjustments. Magicians often speak of technique. But what is it? And what makes for good technique? How do you acquire it? The dictionary defines technique as technical skill, ability to apply procedures or methods so as to effect a desired result. That means paying attention, even to trifles, with experiments yielding countless tiny adjustments until we get the desired result. The whole is greater than the sum of the details. Good technique is achieving a consistent technical outcome. First, let me categorize what I feel are the stages of practice: thoughtful practice, mechanical practice, rehearsal experience, and refinement. Thoughtful practice. Let's assume you are trying to learn a card move. First, you study the finger positions and make sure they are correct. Now you will make adjustments, holding the cards higher, lower, tighter, looser, more forward or back, this angle and that. If you discover a more effective approach or come up with one yourself, by all means, exploit it. But make sure the change is justified and not just ego gratification. Pick a subject, any subject. Pick one you feel you've mastered and try to make an improvement. The good magician looks for problems to solve while the hack always says it is good enough. Take the double lift, for instance. Simple, basic, you say? It may be considered an easy move, but it is also one of the most abused and poorly executed. Think, how to get the break in an unsuspicious manner? How can you match the real action? How do you replace the double card? I guarantee that if you spend at least an hour thinking about this, you will come away with something useful. Why does it make noise? And how can it be prevented? What are the bad angles? And how may I cover them? This is thoughtful practice, analyzing, experimentation, and adjustment. Mechanical practice. Now, once you have settled on an approach, you need to get in as many repetitions as you can. Practice the same thing over and over. Practice in long sessions and in short bursts. Pick up the props throughout the day and get some practice in while you can. You can even turn on the TV or chat on the phone while you play with your props. This relentless repetition is to establish what is called motor memory, training the fingers to work independently from thought. The mind commands, and the fingers react without any further ado. This is mechanical practice. Now, take a look at the move again. Think through every aspect that occurs to you. Does it still make noise when executed? Does it brush? Why? Now the thoughtful practice begins again. Back and forth it goes, mechanical and thoughtful. When are you finished? Well, never. Maybe you might find something that satisfies you for a while, but if you're looking for answers, you will be back on the trail again soon enough. Rehearsal. Rehearsal is a whole other beast. Typically, our rehearsal sessions lack focus. We are often distracted by other possibilities, props, ideas, and techniques, not to mention ringing phones and people coming and going in our space. Eventually, when we appear on stage, we haven't had the experience of performing the routine before and are less likely to feel comfortable. A focused rehearsal can provide you with a realistic experience. It is said that the subconscious cannot distinguish between a real experience and one vividly imagined in detail. Effective rehearsal can give us the virtual experience of a real performance within the familiar and comfortable structure that it provides. Only after you feel that you have the technical requirements to a satisfactory degree are you ready to start rehearsing. As you begin, you will stop and start, make notes, and begin again. Be alert, and make note of what could go wrong, and consider how to prevent a reoccurrence. As your rehearsals progress, you will eventually need to go from beginning to end without stopping, as you would in an actual performance. Rehearsal is working at full performance energy level, imagining an audience in front of you. Let's begin our rehearsal. We will assume at this point that you have written and refined at least a working script, along with the action that will follow as you speak. Clear an area and set a realistic stage environment, with your tables and props placed as they would be in performance. This will dictate where you will stand and walk, eliminating any awkwardness. Don't whisper your lines as if going over it in your mind. You must project, not only to condition yourself for performance, but also to try out different wording, inflections, and timings of your script, and polish the overall delivery. Make note of awkward passages and rewrite them later, so they are more clear and concise. A rhythm can and should develop, which will eventually make memorization a bit easier. But remember to stay loose enough that you may experiment with different deliveries and allow room for improvisation, taking advantage of whatever may occur in performance. I admit to being a bit embarrassed rehearsing out loud. To eliminate some self-consciousness, I make sure my doors and windows are closed so the neighbors don't think I've gone completely off the deep end. One of my techniques for memorizing lines is to record my full script and brief descriptions of the action. I then download the recording to my iPod and go for long walks. As the recording plays, I try to stay 1 or 2 seconds ahead of what I am listening to. At first, this may seem difficult, but eventually, as you learn your lines, it becomes easier. When I miss a line, or use the wrong word or phrasing, I run the recording back a few seconds and drive that correction home. When I feel I have absorbed it, I continue with the rest of the script. If I make significant changes to the script, I might record the script with those changes. This does not mean that I won't change the inflection of delivery of lines in performance, but the intent and the core of my meaning is clearly set. Recording a brief description of your blocking is also very helpful, as when you move to this side of the stage, or reach for that prop, your muscle memory will help you recall what lines go with those actions. Your final dress rehearsals should include just that, the very clothes that you will wear in your show. You can practice the cups and balls in your jeans, but when you are backstage in your dress suit, waiting to go on, you might discover your pocket too small to hold the loads, or no back pocket at all. Let's just say, I've been there. Managing your props can also be tricky business. Sometimes I will practice 2 different routines separately and make the mistake of never practicing them together. When I try the new sequence in my show, I am sometimes surprised to find that the gimmick I need is swirled around in my pocket with other props, or the pocket is full and there is no room for me to smoothly ditch or steal a gimmick. Fawcett Ross recommended to me that instead of a typical stop-start type of rehearsal, I should set my props for 12 performances. Let's say that you are rehearsing vanishing a dollar bill, which will be found inside a lemon. Get 12 lemons, tear the corner off 12 bills, and load them into the lemons. Perhaps use a pin to hold the extra corner to its corresponding loaded lemon to avoid mix-ups. Have a knife, plate, handkerchief, and every incidental prop on hand. Now go through the routine 12 times at full energy as if there were really an audience before you. Every time you drop something or something peeled occurs, make a mental note of it. Cover it as best you can, but don't stop. Try to keep the flow of performance going. After all, you are performing in front of an audience, right? When you have finished, take your bow, then quickly arrange and reset your props and immediately start in again at full energy. Make a quick note if you must, but don't lose your performance focus or frame of mind. Remember what you learn so you needn't make these same mistakes again. Are 12 rehearsals enough? Well, no. But this is concentrated, focused rehearsal and an excellent start. How much is enough? When you haven't the slightest hesitation, thinking what word or action comes next. Even then, if you skip a day or two, you will most likely find a few little glitches that need polishing. It's always good to run through things prior to a performance, running your lines, and going through the handling to get yourself back up to speed. This process is also an excellent method to generate new lines and bits of business, and to prepare you for almost any contingency. The confidence that results is the beginning of what we refer to as stage presence. Mike Skinner had a well-deserved reputation for having an enormous repertoire. You might find his rehearsal method interesting. Michael always kept 5 or 10 cue cards in his wallet. In very tiny writing, there were 2 columns of about 20 entries on each side of the card. This was his working repertoire. If you were sessioning with Michael, He might hand you the list, and you could pick any one of the 100 or so routines on the cards. No matter what you picked, Michael had finessed and rehearsed the routine within a week or two. No excuses, he was always at the top of his game with every trick. Mike would take at least an hour a day to sit down and concentrate on 2 or 3 things from the list. If he went out for breakfast alone, he might practice a few things from the list while he was waiting for his meal. It's important to understand that this was long after Mike had become accomplished with these routines. Mike never stopped growing or improving. With each practice session, he would look at each routine with fresh eyes and analyze it, looking for ways to improve the technique, the presentation, or the routining. He would look for little bits of business he could incorporate, or little lines he could add. He looked for ways to cover his slights and how to get in and get out of everything. The next day he would move down to the next 2 or 3 tricks until he had gone through the entire list. When he reached the end, he would begin again at the top of the list. Is it any wonder why Skinner was so great? John Carney, Magic by Design, 2009. Let's return once more to the sage advice of Darwin Ortiz, who offers yet another applicable strategy for technique, manipulating the way actions in a trick are remembered. Manipulating Memory by Darwin Ortiz. Memory can change the shape of a room. It can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation, not a record of events. Leonard Shelby, in the movie Memento. The true art of memory is the art of attention. Samuel Johnson. When I was in law school, I made extra money by working as an instructor in Harry Lorraine's memory school. One entire lesson was devoted to dealing with the problem of absent-mindedness. The great insight I gained from teaching that particular class was that a memory system is virtually useless in fighting absent-mindedness, as Harry's own legendary absent-mindedness illustrates. The reason is that absent-mindedness is not about memory. It's about attention. As you're jotting down some notes, the phone rings. You put down the pen to answer it. At that moment, you're not thinking about the pen, you're thinking about the phone. Putting down the pen is simply an automatic, unconscious action that is an incidental step in performing the action your mind is really focused on, answering the telephone. After you get off the phone, you think, where did I put that pen? After racking your brain for a while, you may wonder, why can't I remember where I put the pen? The answer is that memory is about retrieving information that you mentally filed away. If you never filed it away, you'll never be able to retrieve it. If you weren't paying attention to what you were doing when you put down the pen, the information was never encoded in your memory banks. A mental search will turn up nothing. This is exactly the phenomenon we're going to try to create in the spectator's mind. This leads us to an important concept, that of psychological invisibility. Sleight of hand technique can make something literally invisible. If you execute the Carney card fold well, the eye cannot see you do it. Physical misdirection can make something literally invisible. If they're looking at point A, they won't see what you do at point B. Psychological invisibility is another matter. It refers to anything that the eye sees, but the mind does not register. This is our goal, to keep certain actions from going into the spectator's long-term memory banks. People tend to remember what they consider important and forget what they consider unimportant. This leads us to a major goal of effect design. Make the important elements seem unimportant, and the unimportant elements seem important. The unimportant is forgettable. and hence immediately forgotten. It is, in effect, edited out. People unconsciously classify actions as important or unimportant based, not on the action itself, but rather on what they perceive to be the motivation behind that action. If they perceive the motivation to be unimportant, they will classify the action as unimportant. If they perceive the motivation to be irrelevant to the matter at hand, they will consider the action irrelevant. That's why an important key to manipulating memory is the use of false motivations. The fallacy of deep motivation. All forms of misinterpretation must occur before the spectators notice anything odd and begin to wonder about it. Once curiosity is aroused, it is hard to satisfy, even when the explanation is genuine. Henning Nelms, Magic and Showmanship. Magicians often complain that some action in an effect is not logical. When magicians say that an action is not logical, they usually mean that it's not motivated. Believing that the motivation has to be logical is what leads to the fallacy of deep motivation. In fact, a motivation can be highly illogical yet completely effective. This is because the roots of effective motivation are not logical, but psychological. While every action in an effect should be properly motivated, in most cases that motivation doesn't have to run deep. That is to say, the motivation needn't be capable of withstanding 20 minutes of rigorous analysis. If the audience feels impelled to analyze why you did something, you've already lost the battle. The purpose of motivating an action is precisely to keep the audience from analyzing it. Many film critics have pointed out that the plots of Alfred Hitchcock's movies don't make much sense when you analyze them. The flaws are precisely in the area of motivation. Why did the protagonist do this? Why didn't he just do that instead? It would have been more logical. But even Hitchcock's severest critics admit that these questions never occur to you while you're watching the movie. Carried along by the story, you accept everything as logical at the time. The master of suspense understood that, if your goal is entertainment, a character's motivation doesn't have to make sense. It just has to seem to make sense. Like Hitchcock's audiences, your audience wants to know what's going to happen next. They'll accept anything plausible that moves the effect forward. In fact, magicians have it easier than Hitchcock did. Film critics and serious film buffs will watch a movie repeatedly and ruminate over it. As a result, they may find logical flaws to pick apart. The spectator only gets to see the trick once. And, having just witnessed a miracle, he will be thinking along completely different lines. He will be asking himself, how, not why. If the motivations for your actions made sense to him at the time, he won't question them in retrospect. Even magicians, when watching an effect, will accept illogical but plausible motivations at face value. It's only when they're learning an effect that, plagued by insecurity, they'll think, gee, this isn't logical, if you think about it. Of course, there is nothing wrong with making an action completely logical as long as it doesn't involve labored explanations, additional handling, or anything else that slows down the pace of the effect. It's important, however, to understand the real purpose of motivating critical actions. Your goal is not to make the action logically unassailable, but to make it psychologically invisible. To achieve this, your actions don't require deep motivation. They just require obvious motivation. Your actions need to make sense in a self-evident way at the moment you perform them. This will guarantee that the spectators will have no reason to analyze the big picture. Your motivations don't have to be able to withstand your audience's critical faculties. They have to avoid awakening those critical faculties. A simple example should clarify this distinction between obvious motivation and deep motivation. In my version of the Traveler's plot, called Coincidentally, Hitchcock Travelers, I take out a pen to have a spectator sign the four aces. When she finishes, I place the pen in my pocket. I then have four cards selected and lost in the deck. At that point, I take out the pen and place it across the tabled aces as a paperweight. This action has a secret purpose. In removing the pen, I load a palmed ace into my pocket. I need to go to my pocket to load the ace, and removing the pen provides the motivation. It could be argued that it doesn't make sense to put the pen away if I'm going to need it later. Since I must have performed this effect many times, I must know that I'll need the pen again. All of this is true, and none of it matters. When I put the pen away, the action makes sense, since the spectator is finished with it. The audience understands why I do it and forgets the action almost instantly. When I later take the pen out, the action makes sense, since I need it to pin down the aces. The audience understands why I do it and forgets the action almost instantly. The time delay between putting the pen away and taking it out again prevents the audience from putting the pieces together and noticing the illogicality. If I were to put the pen away only to take it out again 10 seconds later, that would indeed look odd. It would be easy for people to see the big picture. That's the key. In order for an audience to analyze your motivations deeply, they would have to step back and contemplate the big picture. They're not going to do that. If they're inclined to do any contemplating after the effect, the question they'll contemplate is, how on earth did those aces get out from under that pen and into his pockets? Even if, after the fact, they did try to look at the big picture, they wouldn't remember your incidental actions with the pen because, at the time that you did them, they were psychologically invisible. Mistakenly thinking that every little action requires deep motivation tends to produce labored procedures, long-winded presentations, endless patter rationales, and a generally bloated effect. Keep the motivations simple and obvious, and you'll keep the methodology below the spectator's radar. Finally, keep in mind that these comments relate specifically to effect design. There are many other issues of motivation that relate to presentation. In particular, your actions must make sense in terms of a presentation's dramatic premise. I discussed these sorts of things in Strong Magic. My comments here relate to what we're discussing here, how motivation can help make an action psychologically invisible. Telegraphing motivation. A motivation must be made clear before you perform the action which it explains. When the explanation is offered beforehand, no one is sufficiently interested to examine it closely. Henning Nelms, Magic and Showmanship. Anticipated action is viewed with less suspicion. John Carney, Carnicopia. In magic, the most suspicious reason for doing something is no reason at all. If the audience doesn't detect a reason for an action, they'll search for an ulterior motive. This search brings with it the two things we're most trying to avoid: attention and suspicion. Whenever possible, the motivation for an action should be apparent to the audience at the time of the action. Ideally, it should be apparent a moment before the action. Thus, the audience is psychologically prepared to dismiss the action even before you've performed it. An audience dismisses an action at the moment that they understand the reason for it, not a second before. If the motivation for the action becomes apparent a moment after you've performed it, they may well dismiss the action a moment after you've performed it. By that point, however, they've already taken note of that action. It's gone into their memory bank. Our ideal goal is for them not to take note of the action at all. Having the audience notice an action and then dismiss it is good. Having them not notice the action because they dismissed it, even as you were starting to do it, is better. Suppose you have to go to your pocket to ditch a palmed object. You may motivate this action by openly placing something in your pocket or by openly removing something from your pocket. From the standpoint of psychological invisibility, going to your pocket to put something away is better than going to your pocket to take something out. When you put something in your pocket, the motivation is apparent before your hand has even reached the pocket. When you take something out, the motivation only becomes apparent as your hand emerges with the object. When the only practical option for covering a trip to the pocket is removing an object, it's a good idea to telegraph the action in advance. You might, for example, say, "We're going to need a pen for this." When a moment later you go to your pocket, the audience understands, even before your hand reaches it, that you're going to take out a pen. Thus, their understanding of the motivation for the action precedes the action itself. Let's take a concrete example of telegraphing motivation. In The Quick and the Dead, from Scams and Fantasies with Cards, I use the old idea of loading a palmed card into my pants pocket under cover of pushing in the lining of the pocket. At the beginning of the effect, I remove whatever I have in the pocket and pull out the lining to show it empty. I leave the lining hanging out as I continue the effect. My jacket covers the reversed pocket, so the audience forgets the condition of the pocket, and so apparently do I. Later, after I've palmed a card, I pull back my jacket, glance down, and notice that the pocket is still inside out. The audience, of course, notices the same thing at the same moment. Even as my hand swings down to push the lining back in, the audience has already registered that I'm simply going to do what I forgot to do before. Even before I finish the action, I turn my attention to the assisting spectator and start to give him instructions. Even before I finish the action, the audience turns their attention to what I'm saying to the spectator. Neither my audience nor I have time to dwell on unimportant matters. What I instruct the spectator to do is to shuffle the deck. I make this seem important. In fact, it's unimportant since the selected card is no longer in the deck. It's in my pocket, placed there by an important action made to seem unimportant. Ruses. When it comes to false motivations, a valuable concept is that of the ruse. In Magic by Misdirection, Dario Fitzke defines a ruse as a plausible but untrue reason or action conveying a reason for concealing the true purpose for doing something. In other words, the audience sees what you do. They're only misled as to why you do it. This leads them to misconstrue the importance of the action. We'll now analyze three of the most valuable categories of ruses: the incidental, the accidental, and the extraneous. Incidental actions. Actions that appear necessary but unimportant are only half noticed and soon forgotten. Actions that are unnecessary arouse suspicion. Al Baker, Pet Secrets. Perhaps the epitome of actions that appear necessary but unimportant are what Ascanio termed in-transit actions. Suppose that, during a performance, I'm holding a deck of cards in my right hand and transfer it to my left hand. If you were to ask the audience what I had just done, everyone would say that I had shifted the deck from one hand to the other. Suppose again that I'm holding a deck of cards in my right hand. This time, however, I scratch my right ear with my right hand. In order to do so, I first transfer the deck to my left hand. If you were to ask the audience what I had just done, everyone would say that I scratched my ear. No one would even mention the deck of cards. Transferring the deck from one hand to the other became psychologically invisible. The reason is simple. People interpret actions in terms of their end goal. They don't bother to note, let alone remember, each trivial step on the way to that goal. The in-transit action is the incidental act that has to be gotten out of the way in order to perform the target act. In our example, gifting the deck to the other hand is just something I have to do in order to scratch my ear. Think back to my initial example of the lost pen. You put down the pen to answer the phone. Later, you can't remember where you put it. This is an everyday occurrence that has happened to all of us. The reason we don't remember where we put the pen is that putting down the pen was an in-transit action performed solely to achieve the target act of picking up the phone. Even when you're the one performing the actions, in-transit actions tend to be forgotten. More precisely, they tend not to be noticed in the first place. What works on you will work on your audience. An in-transit action achieves both of Al Baker's goals. First, it provides motivation. It makes it clear that the action is a necessary step in order to achieve the end goal. Second, it minimizes the action's significance. It makes clear that the end goal is the important thing. What happens in transit to that goal is unimportant. The spotlight is on the target act. The in-transit action happens in its shadow. Here is a 3-step formula for applying the in-transit action concept to make key elements of the method psychologically invisible. First, identify an element that is important to the method but unimportant to the effect. Second, find an action that is important to the effect, or can be made to seem so, but unimportant to the method. Third, find a way to perform the first action in transit to the second action. Admittedly, this may sound a little vague when stated in general terms. A couple of examples should help. In The New Hitchcock Aces, in Card Shark, at one point I have 3 aces in my right hand. The deck is in my left hand, and the 4th ace is face down on the table. I have to place the 3 aces on the deck in order to switch them. To do so unmotivated would ignore Al Baker's warning that actions that are unnecessary arouse suspicion. Instead, I use the 3 aces to flip the tabled ace face up. This is a logical action in the context of the effect. However, when I flip the ace over, it falls too far to the left, so I slide it back to its original position. In order to do so, I have to first free my right hand. I do that by placing the 3 aces on top of the deck. Thus, an action that is important in the inner reality of the method, placing the aces on the deck, becomes unimportant in the outer reality of the effect because it's just an action performed in transit to the target action of repositioning the tabled ace. A similar situation arises in The Color of Money, in Scams and Fantasies with Cards, my version of the Follow the Leader plot. Early in the trick, the red packet and the black packet must be brought in contact to effect a transfer of cards. Since contiguity is one of the great clues to method, I wanted to make this momentary contact psychologically invisible. Here is how I did it. I used 2 casino chips, one red and one black, to mark the positions of the 2 packets. The black packet is in my left hand. The red packet is on the table to my left. My right hand removes the 2 chips from my pocket. I drop the black one on the table to my right. While looking at the audience, I start to table the red chip to my left. At the last moment, I look down and notice that the red packet is in the way. Therefore, my left hand turns palm down and picks up the red packet under the cards it already holds. My right hand then drops the red chip where the packet was. The two packets in my hand are then placed in their proper positions, the secret transfer having been accomplished. This sequence deceives because I'm not concerned with the cards. I'm concerned with the chip. I want to place it in the correct position. Picking up the packet and putting it down again are incidental actions needed to make room for the chip. Thus, bringing the packets together, which is important to the method, becomes unimportant to the effect, while properly positioning the chip, which is unimportant to the method, is made to seem important to the effect. A moment later, the audience will no more remember the packets touching than they would remember my transferring the deck from one hand to the other to scratch my ear. Finally, here is an example that also illustrates another issue I've already raised. At the end of Museum Piece from Cardshark, I clean up by switching the packet I've been using for a group of cards on top of the deck. I use Marlowe's visual retention switch. This involves clipping the packet against the deck with the left thumb, then tossing it on the table. As the name indicates, the move is visually very elusive. To be psychologically elusive, however, you need to first motivate placing the packet on the deck and then motivate tossing it on the table. Here is how I do it. My left hand holds the deck and my right hand holds the packet. I want to pick up the card box to put the deck away. So I clip the packet under my left thumb to free my other hand to pick up the box. In that action, I execute the switch. Both clipping the packet under my left thumb and dropping it on the table happen in transit to the end goal of putting the deck in the box. The packet switch thereby fools the mind as well as the eye. My reason for bringing up this last example is that the motivation makes no sense if you analyze it. Why not just drop the packet from my right hand to the table in the first place? This logical hole becomes apparent the moment you start to analyze the big picture. This fact, however, simply doesn't matter. No spectator is ever going to engage in such an analysis. The psychological persuasiveness of each motivation at the moment that it happens forestalls any further thought. Accidental actions. One of the problems we magicians must contend with is that people are always looking for ulterior motives in everything we say or do. To make matters worse, they're usually right. Almost everything we say or do in a performance does have an ulterior motive. Accidental actions are, however, exempt from this suspicion because they are, after all, accidental. I therefore take them at face value. To illustrate how effectively mistakes can motivate necessary actions, I provide a few examples from my own repertoire. I know that these examples work because I've used them countless times. In The Hitchcock Travelers, from Scams and Fantasies, I use a beautiful ploy of Ed Marlowe's to produce the last ace. The effect of the Travelers plot is that 4 signed aces travel to 4 different pockets. In my version, 2 of the aces are loaded into the same pocket. But, thanks to Marlowe, they are still produced from different pockets. I pulled the first ace out of my inner left jacket pocket, which also contains a second ace. I now remove an ace from my left pants pocket. Next, I remove an ace from my right pants pocket. I then reach into my inner left jacket pocket, the same one that the first ace came out of. My face registers mild annoyance as I realize that I've gone to the wrong pocket. I finish by removing the last ace from my inner right jacket pocket. In fact, by means of a beautifully choreographed sequence of Marlowe's, I've secretly transferred the last ace from one pocket to another. But as good as the handling is, it deceives only because the audience is convinced that reaching into the wrong pocket was an honest mistake. I'd be willing to bet that no layperson describing this effect to a friend would ever mention that I briefly reached into my inner left jacket pocket before removing the last ace from my inner right jacket pocket. That's the real test. When people recount a magic effect, they mention the relevant details and leave out the irrelevant ones. A passing mistake falls in the latter category. That's why using a mistake as a motivation can advance our goal of making the important seem unimportant. In Maximum Risk, from Scams and Fantasies, after the spectator has peeked at a card, I deal the deck into two piles. In order for the trick to work, however, the selection must first be repositioned. I must transfer a certain number of cards from the top of the deck to the bottom. Yet, any suggestion that I'm attempting to reposition the selection would spoil the effect. Cutting or shuffling, no matter how artfully done, would fail because they are so obviously deliberate actions. Alternatively, using a pass would require executing the move at the worst possible time. The solution I settled on was to accomplish the displacement under cover of a mistake. I start to deal the cards into two piles. Suddenly, I realize that I forgot to take out the money for the wager I had earlier offered to make. I casually drop the deck on the dealt cards and place it aside as I take out my wallet. After the money is on the table, I pick up the deck and start dealing again. My realization is timed to occur right after I've dealt the number of cards that I need to displace. Dropping the deck on these cards accomplishes my goal. From the audience's viewpoint, forgetting to take out the money wasn't part of the trick. If it's not part of the trick, it can't be part of the method. Everything about how I handle this says, that part didn't count. Now we're starting for real. The false start simply isn't worth remembering. It won't be remembered when the spectators later search for a solution to the mystery. It is best, however, to use mistakes as motivations sparingly. First, if you use this type of ruse too often, it can become obvious. Second, you can come across as the kind of performer who makes a lot of mistakes. This may not be desirable unless it ties in with the persona you're trying to project. Juan Tamariz makes frequent, potent use of mistakes, precisely because of the image he is promoting. Used strategically, however, the mistake is an extraordinarily effective technique for making actions psychologically invisible. People judge actions by their intentions. By definition, a mistake is unintentional. That makes it unimportant and guarantees that it will be unremembered. Extraneous actions. The reason audiences dismiss accidents from consideration is that they're unplanned. Since you must have planned how you would make the trick work, anything that's unplanned can't be related to how the trick works. If, however, the audience can be made to believe that an action, although planned, has nothing to do with the effect, they won't factor it in when trying to determine how the effect happened. The prime example of such apparently extraneous actions in magic is the humorous gag. Any action associated with a gag is taken at face value because your motivation is so obvious: to get a laugh. There is no need for the audience to search any further for motivation. Additionally, getting a laugh has nothing to do with achieving the effect. Therefore, when the audience thinks back on the effect, the gag won't be part of the picture. A while back, I published an effect called the Big Bounce, using the bounce no bounce balls. At one point, I make a $100 wager on the outcome. Under cover of the bill, I perform the necessary switch of the balls. I'm left, however, with a finger palm ball under the bill that I need to ditch. To do so, I start to place the $100 bill back in my pocket as I say, maybe you'd rather just play for fun. As soon as my fingertips enter the pocket, I allow the finger palm ball to roll into the pocket. I immediately appear to register the spectator's disappointment and toss the bill on the table as I say, I didn't think so. It's a mild enough joke, but it gets a smile from the audience. Since the act of going to the pocket was just part of a joke, the audience forgets it a moment after I did it. The best example I've ever encountered of going to the pocket under cover of a gag is a brilliant bit from Jim Pace's Miser's Dream routine. As he produces coin after coin, at one point he looks at one and says, "This one's a Krugerrand. I think I'll keep that one." He then pockets the coin and goes on with the routine. What no one suspects is that when he goes to his pocket, he comes out with another load of coins palmed. No suspicion attaches to his putting his hand in his pocket because it's just a joke. No one gives it a second thought. Since people tend to relax their attention when they laugh, gags provide a double-barreled cover. They provide motivation for the necessary action, and they provide intensity misdirection in the form of the laugh. Gags can not only solve small problems, but also motivate major handling elements. One of the most challenging plots in card magic is to place a card face down on the table, have a spectator name any card, and then show that the tabled card is the one they named. The big problem is the need to look through the deck after the spectator names a card in order to locate it. How do you keep the audience from realizing why you're searching through the deck? Larry Jennings has a version in The Card Right called First Impressions. In it, he does the searching under cover of a genuinely funny gag. No one ever suspects his real reason for looking through the cards because his apparent reason is so obvious: to get a laugh. Roy Walton's Smiling Mule makes brilliant use of a gag to lead the audience to ignore the very handling that produces the magical result. I know from performing my own version, The Last Laugh from Scams and Fantasies, that when people later describe the effect to others, they don't even bother to mention the gag. For another example, go back to Chapter 4 and check the subchapter on the time displacement device. There you'll find a description of a pseudo-estimation effect that uses a simple gag to psychologically erase the key move in the effect. Finally, notice that each of these gags is amusing, but none is fall out of your chair hilarious. Ideally, we don't want the gag to be so funny as to be memorable. We're aiming for the opposite, something funny enough to be motivated, unfunny enough to be quickly forgotten. Altering the final picture. At the climax of an effect, there is a moment when the audience's grasp of the details of that climax is still fluid. The impression has not yet gelled. This can offer the performer a brief window of opportunity to mold the final impression to make it still stronger. This is possible because at the climax of any really amazing effect, the spectators tend to turn inward to absorb it. Often, they also literally turn to each other, looking in each other's faces to see if the other person is affected the same way. After a moment, they will again turn outward toward the performer. In the interval, you may be able to subtly improve the effect's final picture. Juan Tamariz uses this idea when he performs the old rising card effect, where the selection is on top and you secretly push it up with your forefinger. While the audience is reacting to the rise, he pulls the card the rest of the way out and reinserts it in the middle of the deck. He does it openly, but the audience hardly notices because of their state of mind at that instant. By the time they refocus on the performer, he can show the deck from every angle, the card legitimately sticking out of the middle. That becomes the final picture in the audience's memory. That memory will block anyone from ever penetrating the secret of the effect. I do a quick poker deal based on an idea shown to me by Roger Klaus. I deal a head-up round of draw poker to myself and a spectator. Each of us clearly receives 5 cards. But a moment later, when the spectator looks up, I'm holding a large fan of cards. My poker hand has grown to about 35 cards. This impression is partially created by some photo doctoring. I initially add about 15 cards to my poker hand. Much more than that would be risky given the method. I immediately fan these cards and wait for the spectators to look up at me. When they do, they react with surprise and laughter. I seize on that moment to add another 15 cards or so to the poker hand and ribbon spread the cards on the table. The method that I use for the second add-on is bold, but it simply doesn't matter. It happens in the moment that the audience unfocuses in reaction to the initial shock. By the time they refocus, the picture has changed. Of course, they are not conscious of any change in the number of cards. However, as they calm down, this stable, clear picture of 35 cards is waiting for them. It's the one that gets locked into their minds, replacing the fuzzy image they saw for an instant before being thrown into shock. This idea of altering the final picture is related to the concept of backward time displacement. However, here the notion is used not to achieve the effect, but merely to enhance it. Admittedly, opportunities to apply this idea don't come along often, but you have to be aware of the concept to seize them when they do. Final points. Remember that the goal of all ruses, whether incidental, accidental, or extraneous, is to make important actions appear unimportant. Ideally, they will appear so unimportant as to keep them from being encoded into long-term memory banks. If you're unsure whether a particular ploy will do the job, ask yourself whether a layperson recounting the effect to someone else would bother mention the ruse handling in question. For example, would he really have to mention that you had to move a packet of cards out of the way in order to drop a casino chip in its place? If you're unsure of the answer, perform the effect for a layperson and then ask him to recount what you just did. If he doesn't bother to mention the ruse handling, you know that you've achieved your goal. Finally, I want to stress that as useful as these techniques of psychological invisibility are, I don't think that, by themselves, they're strong enough to form the basis for a powerful effect. Think of them as tools for putting the final polish on an effect that already rests on a sound foundation of time displacement, disguising proximity and correlation, and solid conceptual barriers. These techniques can add a further layer of deception to an already strong method, making it virtually bulletproof. Darwin Ortiz, Designing Miracles, 2006. We conclude our discussion of technique with a concept vital to the magician, the spectator's assumptions. We spent an entire chapter earlier in this audiobook on thinking like a spectator. We build on those concepts here, as Michael Close explores 7 assumptions spectators make when they view a magician. But now we take a step further, as Michael offers advice on how we might design our miracles with these erroneous assumptions in mind. Creativity becomes slippery when you try to pin it down and describe how it works. I'm skeptical about most authors who claim to be able to teach it, yet I have returned to this essay countless times in magical development, and reading through Close's 7 assumptions often proves helpful when I am developing a method. Assumptions by Michael Close. Assumption lies at the heart of deception. In fact, I'm not sure deception can exist without it. When we perform, we offer sensory information to our spectators. Most often, this is visual or aural information. The spectators process this information, and they make assumptions. Whether or not these assumptions become convictions depends on our skill in concealing the truth of the situation. Most of the time, we lead the spectators toward the assumptions we wish them to draw. I false shuffle a deck of cards. If the shuffle simulates a real shuffle, then the spectators will assume that the deck has been mixed. If I hand a prop out for examination, the spectators will assume that it must be free from guile. Otherwise, why would I allow it to be examined? Notice, however, that there are levels of assumption. We can destroy the benefits of assumption by overemphasis. If I draw attention to the shuffle, assumption becomes suspicion. If I say, I have here an ordinary piece of rope, the same situation occurs. Assumption works best when we simply offer the information to the spectators without any undue emphasis. Another example. As I patter, I undo the cellophane and break the seal on a deck of cards. This action is observed, and an assumption is reached. This is a brand new deck of cards. Assumption is a vital tool to deception because spectators use their assumptions as the basis for attempting to unravel the method of a trick. If an assumption is false, and the spectators do not realize this, then any logical attempt to reconstruct a method is doomed to failure. As the spectators go through this process, they may begin to doubt the validity of some of their assumptions. Most often, these will be the assumptions that we overemphasized. The more we can turn assumptions into convictions, the less the spectators will be able to doubt their validity, and the more likely we will be able to achieve a result for which the only explanation is magic. There is an aspect of assumption that intrigues me a great deal. Are there assumptions that the spectators bring to a performance without even realizing they are doing so? If there are, and we could set up a situation where these assumptions were false, then we could produce profoundly amazing magic, because the spectators' road to reconstruction would be headed in the wrong direction without them even realizing it. If the best assumptions are those that are underemphasized by us, then having the spectators adopt a false assumption without us doing anything must be the most diabolical use of this tool. But do such subconscious assumptions exist? Yes, they do, and you are already aware of some of them, although you may not have considered them in this way. Before I give the list I have come up with, take a moment and think about this. What kinds of tricks have methods that are absolutely impossible for the spectators to reconstruct, regardless of their analytical or observational powers? There are two types that should be very familiar to you. They are the first two on my list. Please take a moment to consider this. You may come up with answers that differ from mine, and that would be great. This is the way the trick works. First on my list is the unique procedure assumption. Spectators assume that the trick they are watching always proceeds the same way. The trick moves from point A to point B to point C, and if you watched repeated performances, it would always do so. This is certainly a valid assumption. But what if the trick didn't have a linear structure? What if we had multiple possible branches that we could take depending on certain circumstances? Reconstruction of the trick would be impossible, because not only was the spectator's underlying assumption false, they didn't even know that they had made this assumption. The above situation occurs in any trick that involves outs. If we have more than one way to end a trick, then discovering the method becomes very difficult. The most famous multiple procedure effect is Dai Vernon's The Trick That Can't Be Explained. In this routine, we make a prediction, and then we improvise a procedure for causing the spectator to arrive at the predicted card. If our improvisation is logical and convincing, then there is no explanation, since the only assumption made during the entire trick is subconscious and false. I discovered that I have used the idea of multiple procedures in many of my routines, and in unobvious ways. The pothole trick uses an out. If you are familiar with the new ending to Doctor Strange trick, explained on Workers, the video, you may realize that whether or not you restore the card at the end is an out. Several of the effects in this volume concern multiple procedures. Several of them involve placing the out somewhere other than the end of the trick, which is where it normally occurs. The show is starting. A second assumption is the "this is the beginning of the show" assumption. When we walk out on stage, or when we walk up to the table, the spectators assume that we are beginning the show. But what if the show actually began earlier? Pre-show work preys on this assumption and makes possible methods that defy explanation. After all, how can you begin to reconstruct a method if part of the show happened before you began to watch? The show is over. Closely related to the previous assumption is The trick is over assumption. When the climax of the trick is reached, the spectators assume that your work as a magician stops as well. But what if it doesn't? In a well-constructed, multi-phased routine, this assumption and the previous one work in tandem. What appears to be the end of a trick is not. It's really the beginning of the next trick. And what appears to be the start of the next trick is not, for the trick actually began much earlier than was assumed. Check out Reverse Logic and Two Ahead to see how I exploit these assumptions. Another way to use the trick is over assumption is to begin to cover our tracks at the end of a trick. We alter important data and distort memories. I don't believe that this approach has been utilized to any great extent, and it is a fertile field for further exploration. A trick for O'Brien is a simple application of this idea. The loner. A fourth assumption is the magician works alone assumption. This assumption is what makes the use of stooges effective. The spectators assume that the magician and the audience are on two different teams, and collusion is against the rules. Some absolutely amazing effects are possible using secret helpers, but stooges are a double-edged sword. If the spectators begin to suspect that your audience helper is a stooge, then everything else you do loses credibility. But it's possible to use helpers who are not actually part of the show. In a restaurant, the waiters and waitresses can be invaluable assistants, especially when it comes to this next assumption. We just met. The no prior information assumption is a valuable one to exploit, and it is related to the pre-show work idea explained earlier. When you walk up to a table of strangers to perform for them, they assume you have no prior information about them. But if you have used the waiters and waitresses as our secret eyes and ears, then you can accomplish some miraculous things. It is also possible to scope out a table furtively and pick up information that can be used later on. Take a look at Fortune Sugar for an example of such an approach. Too much trouble. I think that spectators also unconsciously embrace the too much trouble assumption. My postulate here is that most spectators think there is a limit to the amount of trouble someone would go to just to fool them. What brought me to this conclusion was the few times when I have explained the memorized deck to layman friends of mine. The thought that I would actually take the time to memorize the order of a deck of cards was inconceivable to them. Consequently, such a method would never occur to them. I think another trick of this nature is Tommy Wonder's third method for the nest of boxes, explained in the Books of Wonder. Polished prestidigitation. My final example is the magician doesn't rehearse mistakes assumption. Spectators assume that a performer rehearses his effects in order to produce a smooth, polished performance, free from the tiny, annoying screw-ups that plague us in everyday life. If a tiny, annoying screw-up occurs during a performance, it must be a genuine mistake. For why in the world would anyone purposely do such a thing? Since the spectators make this assumption subconsciously, we can exploit it to our advantage. An excellent example of this is Juan Tamariz's double-crossing the gaze switch. The switch is based on a tiny, annoying screw-up. The performer has forgotten in which pocket he has placed a necessary prop. Responding to this mistake provides the cover for the switch. Miscalling cards is another example of how to exploit this assumption. If some of this sounds familiar, it is because the magician doesn't rehearse mistakes assumption is the idea behind my corollary to the too perfect theory. See Workers 3 for details. I should point out, though, that this assumption is very sensitive to overemphasis. A small screw-up can be convincing and believable. A major screw-up almost never is. "Oh my goodness, I've accidentally burned up your $20 bill. Whatever will we do now? Your mission, should you decide to accept it. I am positive I have only begun to scratch the surface of the possibilities available to us when we turn subconscious assumptions to our advantage. One of the big problems is discovering what these assumptions are. It's like analyzing your own breathing. Once you start to pay attention to it, it's no longer normal. But the more people who start thinking about this, the more examples that will be discovered, and the more powerful the magic that can be developed. Sometimes the assumptions are not general, but are trick or move specific. I recently discovered a subconscious assumption that relates to the MC spread double lift when it is used as a force. You can read about it, and a trick that I developed from it, in the Workers 5 chapter on sleights. Unfortunately, theory does not excite magicians. Tricks excite magicians. For that reason, most of the routines in Workers 5 use as their underlying method the exploitation of subconscious assumptions. I suggest that you learn a few of them, perform them for laymen, and observe the result. If they stoke your fires, we may all be embarking a new era of discovery. Michael Close, Workers 5, 1997.